Welcome back. Now, after the Reformation, we're going to be moving into some more frankly secular approaches. We'll come back to some religious approaches in a little while too, but at this point now the possibility of a wholly secular picture of evil begins to be possible in Europe in a way that it wasn't apparently before. On these pictures, God looks very far away at best, and morality becomes something quite different for these thinkers. The difference can be shown by a simple question. Does the end justify the means? For earlier thinkers like Augustine or Aquinas, that's a hard thought even to conceive of. Some ancient thinkers would have rejected justice as a coherent idea, someone like Thrasymachus, or Thucydides' representation of the Athenians on the island of Milos. Others would say that justice does not need worldly justification. It's only with Niccolò Machiavelli that we begin to get the idea that some things may be made good by what they accomplish. That, in other words, morality may be real, but only a small part of the world that we inhabit. Now, Machiavelli is a famous figure, but often misunderstood. He was born in Florence in 1469. He died in 1527. And he was secretary and second chancellor to the government. That is, he was very involved in foreign affairs and in European affairs in an age of profound political turbulence, violence, and political skullduggery. In 1512, Machiavelli's faction, his party, was driven from power in Florence. Machiavelli was first exiled to private life, then he was imprisoned, then tortured. When he was released, he was compelled to retire to the Florentine countryside, outside the city. It was there, on his estate, that he wrote his great works. Now, for Machiavelli, notoriously, the prince must love his city more than his own soul. Furthermore, the prince, in order to love his city aright, must learn how not to be good. Those two quotes of Machiavelli, really famous quotes, are actually quite not only significant but obscure. Understanding what they mean and why Machiavelli thought that understanding them demanded that a prince had to undergo a new kind of education before he could be an effective prince, is the main aim of this lecture. It's a lecture in sorts, in a way, about the nature of political evil. Machiavelli seems to be the first person to think that the reality of evil in politics is in some important way inescapable, and that the prince, instead of trying to resist it everywhere, should, at certain points and in certain ways, work with the grain of politics rather than attempt to resist it for a larger, genuinely moral end at the end of his efforts. Now, Machiavelli is often accused of being a complete nihilist or a relativist. And that's not really fair. We only get that picture if we read The Prince, the one book that people often read of his. In fact, he wrote a major Renaissance political treatise called the Discourses on Livy's history of the early Roman state, which is still probably his greatest work. It's an amazing work of philosophical and political acuity. But for good or ill, that's not what he's really known for. His last and his most notorious work is Il Principe, the Prince, which was only published in 1532, 5 years after he had died. Now, no book, it seems to me, has been more publicly vilified and privately read. Shakespeare, in his plays, speaks of the murderous Machiavelli, and yet Shakespeare's sovereign, Queen Elizabeth I of England, read Machiavelli quite avidly. She was, in fact, quite a learned sovereign, quite an educated woman, and adept at translations, especially of classical historians. So she had read Machiavelli first on Livy, But then she found the prince and fell in love with that as well. In fact, she kept one book under lock and key in her bedchamber, in her palace, and that was a French translation of Machiavelli's The Prince. So, more publicly vilified, more privately read, probably Machiavelli would have approved of that fate for his work. He sometimes is called the first modern political man because of his cold-eyed vision of what is at stake in politics and what must be done. You will have heard that Machiavelli is a relativist, a nihilist, a man who counseled mendacity, duplicity, skullduggery, and a bloody-minded maleficence to politicians. And again, while Machiavelli himself would not have been entirely displeased to have his works become camouflaged by that reputation, for those who care to read him, another and more profound, and for that reason more complicated, shadowy, and disquieting meaning emerges. His basic idea, it's partially visible in The Prince, more visible elsewhere, but The Prince makes sense with this idea, is that goodness is real and virtue is real, but that moral perfection cannot provide any simple guidelines for the governance of our world, especially in politics. This is why the prince, or any political ruler, or anyone involved in politics, for that matter, must learn, as Machiavelli puts it, how not to be good. Here are two examples of what I mean. First, a prince, Machiavelli thinks, is wise to punish with unremitting fierceness rebels against the realm, even after they have surrendered. Not most centrally because they truly deserve that punishment, but rather because when they are seen to be so punished, it will deter others from undertaking similar rebellions, and thus further secure the stability of the realm. Fear, and we'll come back to this in a minute, turns out to be very important as a political motivator for Machiavelli. More controversially still, Machiavelli recommends the use of proxies for especially unpleasant deeds. Proxies whom the prince can later turn on and punish for performing those very deeds. In other words, a lot of the dirty work of politics should not be done by you. It should be done by someone else who can then be stained with the nastiness of it, and then you can distance yourself from them. Now, Machiavelli recommends this, not, note, so that the prince himself can get away with these crimes. Machiavelli is not interested in the prince getting away with the crimes, but because that way the dirty work that needs to be done to keep the community moderately safe and stable manages to get done, while the resentments of the citizenry, reasonable resentments about that dirty work, resentments that, Machiavelli clearly notes, could themselves be sources for more instability in the future unless they are diffused. While those resentments find a suitable target who is seen to be properly punished in a way that dissipates those resentments, or at least lowers them to a level that the realm can safely endure. Now just note for a second, that whole long thing I just said, it was like a paragraph. That's one sentence. It's an attempt, it's a very Machiavellian sentence. It's an attempt to accommodate in one thought the multiple dimensions of politics that Machiavelli says a ruler, a politician, needs to keep in mind at all times. There is a good, there is a bad. The central aim is stability. But you have to understand people's psychologies, how they resent things, and how to quiet those resentments. Not because you want them to like you, but because you don't want them to render the polity, render the political community unstable. Now, in Machiavelli's time, one of the greatest enemies of liberty and freedom in his world was the family of the Borgias. And in fact, perhaps the greatest, most vicious of the Borgias, well, most rough of the Borgias, not most vicious, was Cesare Borgia. Machiavelli actually admires Borgia's ruthlessness. Not because he worships bloody-mindedness, Machiavelli's not that kind of person, but because Borgia, for Machiavelli, exhibited a unity and coherence of purpose and intent that was good for the polity. People inside, under his rule, people inside his community knew what he was about, and people outside his community knew what he was about. There was never any uncertainty about what he would do at any moment, unless he wanted to surprise people, right? In other words, the integrity of a political agenda, its predictability, is for Machiavelli the absolute baseline for a successful political regime. To be chaotic, to be unpredictable, to be unstable, this is not a recipe for success. It's not a recipe for a happy polity. Though again, you want to be able to surprise people from time to time, you nonetheless also want to be able to be a predictable and stable place for them. And all of this, and even in his praise of Cesare Borgia, this is an enormous change from earlier political treatises, a genre of political writing called the Mirror of the Prince, which was a very popular genre of medieval political writing. In these treatises, the writers talked again and again about the first and foremost thing that the ruler has to be is good. The ruler has to be ordered. The ruler has to be moral. The ruler has to be right. Machiavelli rips all of that away. He says it's simply unrealistic. It's unrealistic in two different ways. First of all, it's unrealistic about what actually is possible for political rulers. Many of them are not going to be good people, not essentially. Secondly, though, he thinks that it is deeply unrealistic precisely because it mistakes the cause and effect of certain actions in the polity. A nice and decent ruler may seem weak to some people. A kind and generous and merciful ruler may let rebels go when he should not do that. A just ruler may generate resentment among those people who supported his getting into power, and yet not be able to diffuse the resentment of those people who were against his getting into power about the fact that he got into power. In other words, a simple moralism in politics for Machiavelli is anti-realistic and so anti-political. It is against the good of the polis. To talk about people being good as the first virtue of politics is actually bad for politics, morally bad. The whole point of his argument was to care for the polis, for the polity, and the rhetoric, not just the arguments of the prince, his work, are meant to do just that. Essentially, he is preaching a kind of realism, sort of like Thucydides. Machiavelli makes the claim throughout that text to see the world as it is, not how we would like it to be. Let me stop here for a second. The central political anxiety that Machiavelli has is instability. He's seen too much anarchy, too much chaos in his world, and he realizes that in important ways we have to be able to ensure stability in our world for any of the other goods of politics or private life to go forward. This means, then, that for Machiavelli, the stability of the political order has to come before the ethical happiness of that order. And this raises profound questions, and Machiavelli is the first one really to raise them, about the continuity of political life with our ordinary, everyday, day-to-day, interpersonal, ethical lives. This is a huge thing, and we'll see it come up again and again. In different ways, thinkers throughout the rest of this course are going to be asking this question. Politics is a complicated thing. How can we anticipate that, in fact, morality will be some useful or stable, predictable system that we can use to govern our mutual life. When we can't ensure that everyone is on the same page about what's right and wrong, and in fact, when we know that politics inevitably generates judgments on different people's minds that actually disagree about what's right and wrong, how can we expect then that simply telling people that they ought to be good, or they ought to be kind, or my God, they ought to be nice, is going to be an effective way of being in politics? In fact, you set yourself up to lose. And not just to lose personally, but to harm the political causes that you support. And not just the personal political causes that you support, but to harm your very political community itself. Understanding that basic claim of Machiavelli's is important to seeing how he thinks people ought properly to understand the world. And that unlocks a whole political psychology for him. Because once you get away from the idea that basically you ought to be good, you can then look around and see how people act, especially in politics. And he has an interesting point to make about politics. He says, in politics, people are governed by two large bodies of motivation, two large families of motivations. They're governed by their loves, and they're governed by their fears. But by and large, they're really governed by their fears. Occasionally, love will help. Occasionally, love will manifest itself in some good thing. But by and large, you can rely on the thought that people are going to be able to do things more if you scare them with certain concrete threats than if you offer them certain vague hopes of good things in the future. Right? This is why the police don't drive around streets offering people rewards for driving under the speed limit, even though actually they would be less busy in some streets if they did, in some highways, if they did try to actually reward people who are going under the speed limit, because most of us go over the speed limit most of the time. That's one fact, this interesting political psychology for Machiavelli, that people are really driven more by their fears, and that's a fact that we have to acknowledge. The other fact is another very crucial word for him, fortuna, fortune. Fortuna, for Machiavelli, plays a huge role in politics. Fortuna is accident, luck, all sorts of stuff that happens that you have no control over. Perhaps you become the ruler of a country that faces immediate economic crisis, and your agenda for changing the country's way has to take second place to dealing with that economic crisis. Perhaps there are enormous military threats on your border from an unstable regime that has collapsed. Suddenly, your polity has to be organized to defend itself against that unstable regime. People who weren't reading Machiavelli, right? Again and again, Machiavelli says, a ruler has to be bad because at times they will find that the events they have to face are not in their control. And yet, nonetheless, they are responsible for facing those events. There's a famous line about Napoleon, the French emperor, who did read Machiavelli. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor of France, a quite interesting satanic moment, he apparently then said to the surrounding audience, I now hereby take on myself the responsibilities for all that France has done since Louis I, right? Since 600 or 700 years before him. What did he mean by that? He meant that, in fact, any ruler of a country, the moment they step into office, is from that moment forward responsible for everything that has happened and that might happen. And you can complain about, this isn't my fault, this happened before we were there, it's not fair. That's not going to be useful for you, Machiavelli says. The truth is, you're going to have to come to terms with the thought that you are, in fact, responsible for this polity. And that means no one but you is going to be able to control what goes on. And that means sometimes you may have to do some stuff which is relatively unpleasant in order to secure the good of the community. Now, a lot of this presents itself, or is read as, being strategies about being wicked, being a nasty person, being a naughty prince. But the basic point Machiavelli is trying to make here is not about teaching people how to be evil. My God, anybody who's been in politics knows that most people know how to be bad already. The point for Machiavelli is that you need to teach the prince in these ways how not to be good, precisely in order that they not become, in a complete and total way, evil. Machiavelli, that is trying to say that the most powerful medicine against the prince's corruption is precisely the ability to learn how to control those situations where dirty hands have to happen, dirty acts, dirty deeds have to be done. In that situation, it will always be easy for a prince to feel like they ought to be, how do I want to say this? To feel like they are in some sense staining their souls. Machiavelli wants to give them an account of how they may have to do certain acts which everyone would agree are evil, but nonetheless in a way that enables them to understand the necessity of doing those acts for the good of the state as a whole. Machiavelli wants to teach rulers how to be evil in a cold-blooded way so that the evil doesn't infect them and make them an entirely hot-blooded evildoer. Now, one interesting and important challenge to Machiavelli is that actually a lot of evil, maybe even in political terms, is not actually very cold-blooded. A lot of the evil we experience in our world and we experience in ourselves is not a matter of cold and calculated rational deliberation. It's hard to imagine, that is, a critic of Machiavelli could say, how someone can properly use all of evil in this cold-blooded way. Isn't Machiavelli asking for a level of psychological distance, frostiness, and alienation from those around you on the level for the prince in a way that is impossible for at least almost every human being? Can princes be expected to be self-mutilating in this way? Machiavelli might reply, that may be so. But that's why being a prince is so hard. In a way, you have to become inhuman. You have to make a stone of your heart. And the reality of princedom is that stony-heartedness. For Machiavelli, it's unwise to try to disguise that, to coat it in the sickly sweet perfume of pretty rhetoric, like a perfume covering over an overripe chamber pot. It's better to recognize the realities of what being a prince entails before you begin that task, when you have time to prepare and to consider. And this is why, along with saying a prince must learn how not to be good, he also says a prince must love his city more than his own soul. One more thing to note about Machiavelli. He inaugurates a new stage in thinking about evil, because he's the first major thinker for whom the past as past is a real issue. Not as what the tradition has given us from the past, but what we can seek out and find in that past. What is a resource for us there to be mined, in a way. Let me explain what I mean. Up till now, the thinkers we've studied have gained access to the whole sum of past wisdom about evil through their immediate predecessors, their teachers, in the form of tradition, which was what their teachers taught them was relevant from the past, right? So that Aquinas and Anselm access the history of thinking about evil really through their teachers, through thinking through how Augustine, for example, gives them a picture of the past, okay? This is a powerful way that the past influences these thinkers, so that Anselm or Aquinas or whomever, these thinkers are historically minded in a way, but they found in that past precisely what their own direct teachers taught them was there to find. Machiavelli is different. He's the first person to attempt to reach kind of back behind the immediate past, in his context, behind the medieval tradition of the mirrors of princes, in order to recover a more usable past than the one that that tradition offered him. He kind of brushes aside the outstretched hands of the medieval political thinkers that are filled with the riches of the tradition that they want to give him. And again, he kind of reaches around them, behind those thinkers, to recover what those thinkers obscure and obstruct in the very effort of trying to give him what they want to give him. Machiavelli didn't want their tradition. He wanted to take from the past, and especially past Greek and Roman thinkers, a new kind of tradition, something new that they had that the medievals didn't access, this kind of darker picture of what politics is about. Now, there are two important things about this. One implication of it about the past, and one implication for the future. First, about the past. The paradigm of appealing to a deep past as a more useful resource than the immediate past, eschewing a tradition that one begins from. This is a very Renaissance sort of move. There's a sort of parallel here with Luther, who also sought to go directly back to Scripture without reference, he thought, to what past theologians or church councils or popes had taught about what Scripture said. Though Machiavelli is different than Luther also in going back further than Luther did to pre-Christian sources, right? Secondly, though, another point about the future. This very view of reaching back to the past in this way assumes some sort of real break, a real rupture between the past and the present and the future. Some profound way that the challenges we face need new thinking, and that the past that is immediately available to us, the past of tradition, what tradition wants to give us, is no longer useful for that new thinking. We'll see this theme, this approach, again and again in future thinkers. So many people in our future lectures will find them saying that what we need to do is recover, in some sense, some past wisdom that we've forgotten recently. After all, the point of the appeal to the deep past that Machiavelli makes here, the point to eschewing the medieval tradition of the manuals of princes, the mirrors of princes, is precisely in order better to equip us for the future. The first thought that Machiavelli has, it suggests here, is that a rupture has happened, and that the resources our immediate ancestors give us are really inadequate to meet the challenges that we now presently face. This is a new kind of approach to the past, what we can call the first glimmers, really, of what we think of as truly historically conscious-minded thinking. This consciousness creates both continuity with the past, because it reaches back to grasp something in it, and a kind of rupture, because in that very gesture of reaching back to the past, it suggests that we need to reach back, that in some essential way, the past is not immediately available to us, that we need to go find it. Machiavelli is the first self-conscious thinker to appeal to history in this way, but also, and because of that, the first to be convinced of some fundamental break, some rupture between us and the past. This makes Machiavelli a prophet methodologically in the way he approaches thinking about evil historically, just as much as he is a prophet and an original thinker in the content of his thinking. Now, in the next lecture, we'll move from Machiavelli's more impressionistic and elusive, imagistic description of a darker vision of politics to a more rigorously systematic thinker who had some of the same thoughts, namely Thomas Hobbes.